All right, ready to dig in?
Always.
Today's deep dive takes us back, way back to the dawn of civilization.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
We're talking about the agricultural revolution.
Right. That turning point when humans decided, hey, let's trade in these foraging baskets for plows. Settle down, it's time.
You know, it's often seen as this huge leap forward for humanity.
Oh, absolutely. A pivotal moment.
But what if I told you it might have been the biggest mistake our ancestors ever made?
It's a fascinating thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
For millions of years, humans thrived as hunter-gatherers,
Yeah.
living in small nomadic groups perfectly in sync with the rhythms of nature.
Right.
Imagine for 2.5 million years, that was the way of life.
It's kind of amazing to think about, yeah.
So the question is, why change? What prompted this shift that quite literally reshaped the world?
It's mind-blowing when you put it like that. I
That's
mean,
all.
it's not like they were just wandering around aimlessly.
Yeah,
These were people who knew how to work with nature.
absolutely.
Controlled burns, understanding plant cycles, even having social structures that supported their way of life.
Exactly. And that's crucial to understand because it shatters this myth that humans suddenly became brilliant and invented agriculture.
Right.
The reality is much more complex, much more piecemeal, and honestly, much more accidental.
Okay.
For example, Harari points out that only a tiny fraction of plants and animals can even be domesticated.
Wow.
That means the agricultural revolution wasn't happening everywhere.
Right.
It depended on what plants and animals were available in specific locations.
It's like a giant game of chance, with the stakes being the future of humanity.
It really is.
He mentions the Fertile Crescent with its wild wheat and goats,
Of course, yeah.
or Mesoamerica with its maize and beans.
Right.
Talk about being in the right place at the right time, huh?
It really is remarkable. And it was a gradual shift, not some overnight revolution.
Right.
Think about the Natufians, for instance. They lived in the Levant around 12,500 years ago.
Mm.
And while they still hunted and gathered, they'd begun to build permanent villages
Okay.
and store surplus grain.
Yeah.
They were right on the edge of a whole new way of life, even if they didn't know it yet.
It's like they were dipping their toes in the water without realizing the tide was about to come in.
Right.
And speaking of tides changing, this is where things get really interesting because the rise of agriculture wasn't just a story of humans taming nature. It was nature in the form of wheat taming us.
That's the crux of Harari's argument, this wheat bargain, as he calls it. Think about it. Wheat went from a random grass to a global powerhouse.
Wow, yeah.
How? By getting humans to do its bidding. We cleared forests.
Wow.
We rerouted rivers. We toiled endlessly to create the perfect environment for wheat to flourish.
It's like wheat hacked the human system. We became slaves to this single crop, pouring all our energy into its success, even if it meant backbreaking labor and a much less diverse diet than our hunter-gatherer ancestors.
And that's an important point.
In fact, Harari uses the example of a malnourished child in first-century China,
Right.
a stark reminder that even with agriculture, life wasn't always a picnic.
Not at all. Early farmers often face malnutrition, diseases spread by close contact with animals
Oh, right.
and each other,
Makes sense.
and were incredibly vulnerable to famine if their crops failed.
Right.
And ironically, their bones actually show signs of harder work and more disease than their hunter-gatherer counterparts.
So it's like tougher life, less healthy, and yet here we are. Okay, so if things were so tough, why didn't they just go back?
Yeah.
Why stay stuck in this wheat-fueled grind?
Well, imagine each generation building on the last, making small changes that add up to a completely different world.
Okay.
And crucially, agriculture led to population booms.
A lot more people.
Those extra mouths needed to be fed, making it almost impossible to abandon the system.
Right.
Flawed as it was,
Yeah.
that was keeping them alive.
It's like you're stuck, right?
Totally.
But hey, at least our ancestors had a steady food supply, even if it came with a side of hardship. I mean, it had to be easier than chasing gazelles all over the savannah, wasn't it?
That's where this idea of the luxury trap comes into play.
Okay.
Something I think you can relate to even today.
I think so, yeah.
You work hard to afford that new gadget.
Yeah.
That bigger house.
Sure.
That promotion.
Right.
Thinking it'll bring you ease and happiness.
Yeah.
But more often than not, it just leads to new demands, new anxieties, new reasons to stay stuck on the treadmill.
Oh, tell me about it. My to-do list feels like it has its own gravitational pull sometimes.
Yeah.
But how does this luxury trap apply to our farming ancestors?
Imagine you're that early farmer. You put in the backbreaking work to till the land, thinking this means more food, more security for my family. And maybe in the short term, it does. But what happens when that surplus leads to more children? More children to feed means more land to clear, more crops to plant, and suddenly you're working harder than ever.
Yeah, you can't exactly pack up and go back to foraging when you've got a village full of hungry mouths depending on you. Talk about a tough spot to be in. So, on the one hand, it sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, here we are, thousands of years later,
Right.
living with the legacy of that very revolution.
We are.
How do we make sense of that?
From an evolutionary perspective, the agricultural revolution was a phenomenal success.
Okay.
It wasn't about individual happiness or even quality of life.
Right.
It was about survival, replication, passing on those genes. Yeah. And on that score, agriculture, for all its downsides, allowed Homo sapiens to multiply at an astonishing rate.
Wow.
We went from scattered bands of hunter-gatherers to villages to towns and eventually sprawling cities.
Right.
More humans meant more carriers for the Homo sapiens DNA,
Right.
which in evolutionary terms equals success.
That's a pretty mind-blowing way to look at it, right? Though we tend to equate progress with things getting, I don't know, easier, better. But what if we've been measuring it all wrong? What if, as Harari suggests, we've been focused on the wrong metrics all along?
It challenges our assumptions, doesn't it? And it gets even more complex when we consider the archaeological discoveries at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey.
Göbekli Tepe. Yeah.
This site throws a real wrench in the traditional narrative of the agricultural revolution.
Okay, Göbekli Tepe. This is where things start to feel like an Indiana Jones movie. What makes this place so special?
Imagine this. Massive stone pillars, intricately carved with animals and abstract symbols, all dating back to around 9500 BC. That's older than Stonehenge,
Wow.
older than the pyramids,
Really?
and it wasn't built by farmers.
Okay.
It was built by hunter-gatherers.
Ooh, so these weren't just simple structures either, right? We're talking about something far more complex than anyone thought hunter-gatherers were capable of.
Exactly.
Wow.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Göbekli Tepe is located right in the heartland of early wheat domestication,
Okay.
very near to where einkorn wheat, one of the first domesticated varieties, originated.
Hold on a second. Are you saying that agriculture, this monumental shift in human history, might have arisen as a way to support the construction of temples?
It's possible.
That's a wild thought.
It is a possibility, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Think about the resources needed to build a site like Göbekli Tepe, the labor, the food to sustain everyone.
Yeah.
Maybe agriculture didn't begin as a way to make life easier, but as a way to support a much grander, more ideological project.
So instead of being driven by necessity, maybe agriculture was driven by belief, by a desire to connect with something larger than themselves. It really makes you question everything you thought you knew, doesn't it? It's mind-blowing to think that something as seemingly straightforward as agriculture might have such complex origins.
It really is.
It really throws a wrench into our neat, linear view of history.
Definitely.
But this whole conversation, it's got me thinking about the other players in this story,
Okay.
the animals. We've talked about the impact of agriculture on humans, but what about the sheep, the cows, the pigs? Their world changed dramatically too, right?
Absolutely. It's easy to overlook. But
Yeah.
the agricultural revolution wasn't just about plants.
Right.
It was about the wholesale transformation of animal lives as well.
Yeah.
Imagine, if you will, you're a wild ox, roaming free with your herd across the plains.
Okay.
Now, picture yourself confined, castrated, forced to plow fields under the relentless sun.
Oh, wow.
That's the reality countless animals were subjected to.
Harari doesn't shy away from those harsh realities either. He talks about pigs having their noses mutilated to prevent them from rooting, calves being separated from their mothers at birth, practices that would send most people today into an uproar.
And it's essential to remember this wasn't just something that happened in the distant past. Many of these practices persist in some form even today.
Yeah, that's true.
Factory farms, for instance, or selective breeding that prioritizes profits over animal welfare. Those early bargains we struck with domesticated animals
Right.
continue to shape their lives and, in turn, our world, even today.
It's pretty sobering stuff, honestly, though Harari does mention that some domesticated animals, like pets or prized horses, might have actually benefited from their relationship with humans.
True, but those are the lucky few. We're talking about billions of animals whose lives were fundamentally altered by the shift to agriculture.
Right.
It circles back to that question of how we define success. From an evolutionary standpoint, these animals are incredibly successful. Their genes have proliferated across the globe, but at what cost?
Yeah.
If we factor in individual well-being, it's a much different and, frankly, more complicated story.
It's almost as if we've traded the well-being of countless individuals for the success of a few species, both plant and animal.
It makes you think.
It makes you wonder, are we repeating those same patterns today with our relentless pursuit of progress, even if it means unintended consequences down the line?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Hmm.
We consider ourselves more advanced than our ancestors, but are we really?
Yeah.
When we look at the environmental impact of our choices, the social inequalities that persist, the potential for unforeseen consequences that accompany technological advancements, it begs the question, are we any wiser than those early farmers who inadvertently stumbled into a bargain that reshaped the world?
It's certainly something to ponder. The agricultural revolution, a turning point in human history, a story of innovation and unintended consequences, and a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line upwards. It might be more like a winding path with unexpected twists and turns, even if those turns lead to dead ends.
Well said. And on that note, if there's one key takeaway from our deep dive today,
Yeah.
it's that even the most transformative events in human history, the ones we often view through a lens of progress, are far more nuanced and morally complex than they appear.
And on that note, we wrap up our deep dive into the agricultural revolution. It's a topic that sparks endless debate and prompts important questions about our place in the world.
Absolutely.
If today's conversation resonated with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. You can share them online using hashtag #DeepDiveOfRevolution. And be sure to join us next time when we'll delve into another captivating chapter of the human story. Until then, keep those questions coming, and thanks for taking this deep dive with us.